In 20 feet of water, the ship began to list. What happened next would kill 844 people in less than 5 minutes, making it deadlier than the Titanic disaster that had occurred just 3 years earlier. But unlike the Titanic, whose sinking became immortalized in history, the SS Eastland catastrophe would be deliberately buried, forgotten, and erased from national memory within months. The ship didn't sink in a storm. It didn't strike an iceberg. It didn't even leave the dock. It simply rolled over. The SS Eastland was born defective. Launched in May 1903 in Port Huron, Michigan, the steel-hulled passenger steamer was designed by naval architect Sidney Jenks to carry 3,500 passengers on excursion runs across the Great Lakes. From its first voyage, the ship exhibited a dangerous tendency to list, leaning heavily to one side or the other without apparent cause. The problem was fundamental and unfixable. The Eastland had been designed with a narrow beam of just 38 feet, compared to its length of 269 feet, creating an inherently unstable ratio. The hull was shallow drafted to navigate Chicago River's limited depth. Meanwhile, the ship's center of gravity sat dangerously high, with 4 complete passenger decks stacked above the waterline, and massive machinery positioned too far above the keel. But the ship was profitable, and profit mattered more than stability. Captain Jordan Peru piloted the Eastland on its maiden voyage from Cleveland to Buffalo in 1903. Years later, in testimony before federal investigators, he would describe the vessel's behavior as unlike anything he had encountered in 30 years of maritime service. The ship would list 15 to 20 degrees without warning. Passengers would stumble. Dishes would slide off tables. Water would slosh violently in the ballast tanks, amplifying each roll rather than dampening it. She was a cranky boat from the day she was launched, Peru testified. You couldn't depend on her. She'd act one way one day and another way the next. The ship's owners knew, the captains knew, the engineers knew. Yet the Eastland continued operating. In July 1904, during an excursion run from Chicago to Michigan City, the Eastland listed so severely to starboard that passengers panicked and rushed to the port side. The sudden weight shift caused the ship to list even more dramatically to port, with water pouring through open gangway doors. Only the quick action of the chief engineer, flooding ballast tanks on the port side, prevented capsizing. 700 passengers were aboard. They came within minutes of dying. The incident should have ended the Eastland's career. Instead, the ship's owners simply instructed captains to be more careful about passenger distribution. In 1906, the ship listed so severely during a trip on Lake Erie that the United States Department of Commerce's Steamboat Inspection Service launched an investigation. Federal inspectors examined the vessel and concluded that its metacentric height, a crucial measure of stability, was dangerously inadequate. They recommended structural modifications. The owners made minimal changes. They added ballast. They slightly lowered some of the upper deck structures. But the fundamental design flaws remained, because fixing them would have required rebuilding the entire ship. More importantly, something had changed in the regulatory environment that would make the Eastland even more dangerous. On April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic, killing 1,517 people. The disaster shocked the world and led to immediate calls for improved maritime safety regulations. Congress responded by passing the Seamen's Act of 1915, which became law on March 4th, 1915, just 4 months before the Eastland disaster. Among its many provisions, the Act required passenger vessels to carry sufficient lifeboats and life preservers for every person aboard. The intention was noble. The execution was deadly. The Eastland, already dangerously top-heavy, was now required to add 11 additional lifeboats to its upper decks. Each wooden lifeboat weighed approximately 5,000 pounds when fully equipped. The additional weight, positioned at the highest point on the ship, raised the center of gravity even further and made the vessel even more unstable. Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson repeatedly warned management about the implications. He understood the physics. Adding weight above the waterline would make the ship more likely to capsize. He recommended against compliance with the new regulations unless the ship underwent extensive modifications to lower its center of gravity. His warnings were ignored. Installing lifeboats was cheaper than rebuilding the ship, and federal law now required those lifeboats. The irony was brutal. Regulations designed to save lives after the Titanic disaster would directly contribute to killing 844 people just months later. The St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company operated the Eastland as part of the Chicago South Haven route and for special excursion charters. On July 23, 1915, the company confirmed its largest charter of the season. The Western Electric Company's Hawthorne Works plant in Cicero, Illinois, had reserved 5 steamships, including the Eastland, to transport 7,000 employees and their families to the annual company picnic in Michigan City, Indiana, across Lake Michigan. Western Electric was one of Chicago's largest employers, manufacturing telephone equipment for the Bell system. The Hawthorne Works employed over 40,000 workers, many of them immigrants from Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. The annual picnic was a highlight of the year, a rare day of leisure for workers who typically labored 6 days a week in the factory. Tickets were free for employees and cost 75 cents for family members. By July 20th, all 7,000 spots were filled. The company chartered the Eastland, Theodore Roosevelt, Petoskey, Rochester, and Maywood to transport the crowd. The ships were scheduled to depart between 7:30 and 9 a.m. from the Chicago River docks between Clark and LaSalle Streets, just west of the Clark Street Bridge. The weather forecast for July 24th was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the low 70s, light winds, ideal conditions for a lake crossing. On the evening of July 23rd, Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson inspected the Eastland at its dock. He checked the ballast tanks, the engine room, the pumping systems. Everything appeared mechanically sound, but Eriksson remained uneasy. He knew the ship's history. He knew its instability. He knew the additional lifeboats made it even more dangerous. He mentioned his concerns to Captain Harry Pedersen, who had commanded the Eastland for the past year. Pedersen was an experienced lake captain, respected by his crew. He shared Eriksson's concerns, but felt trapped by circumstances. The charter was booked. The company expected him to sail. Federal regulations required the lifeboats that made the ship dangerous. "We'll manage the ballast carefully," Pedersen told Eriksson. "We'll watch the passenger distribution. We'll take every precaution." Both men knew that might not be enough. Meanwhile, across Chicago, thousands of Western Electric employees prepared for the next morning. Families laid out their best clothes. Mothers packed picnic baskets. children were too excited to sleep, anticipating the steamship ride, the beach, the games planned for the picnic. Bobby Sindelar was 8 years old. His father worked at the Hawthorne works as a machinist. The family lived in a small apartment in Cicero. This would be Bobby's first trip across Lake Michigan, his first time on a big steamship. His mother had sewn him a new sailor suit for the occasion. He could barely contain his excitement. Mariana Warfel was 22 years old, working as a telephone assembly worker at Hawthorne. She lived with her parents and 4 siblings in a crowded tenement near the factory. The 75 cents for a picnic ticket represented nearly a full day's wages, but she had saved for months. She planned to meet her boyfriend, also a Western Electric employee, on the boat. George Sindelar, Bobby's father, had worked at Hawthorne for 6 years. He was 34 years old, a skilled machinist who had immigrated from Bohemia in 1907. He had brought his wife and children to America 2 years later. The Western Electric job had given his family stability, a path to the American dream. He looked forward to this day all year. None of them would survive past 7:30 a.m. the next morning. Saturday, July 24th, 1915, began with unusual bustle at the Chicago River docks. By 6 a.m., hundreds of Western Electric employees and their families had already arrived, clustering near the gangplanks of the 5 chartered steamships. The Eastland was moored closest to the Clark Street Bridge, with the Theodore Roosevelt immediately behind it. 3 additional ships waited further down the dock. The Eastland's crew arrived at 6:15 a.m. Captain Harry Pedersen conducted a final inspection of the ship. Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson checked the ballast system one more time. The ballast tanks, located low in the hull, could be filled or emptied with water to adjust the ship's stability. Proper ballast management was crucial for a vessel with the Eastland's tendency to list. At 6:50 a.m., the crew opened the Eastland's gangplanks. Passengers began boarding immediately. The rush was immediate and chaotic. 7,000 people were trying to board 5 ships within a 2-hour window. The Eastland, as the first ship in line and the closest to the Clark Street Bridge, attracted the heaviest initial crowds. Passengers pushed forward, eager to secure good viewing positions on the upper decks. Nobody wanted to be stuck below deck on such a beautiful morning. By 7 a.m., over 1,000 passengers were aboard. The ship began listing to port, away from the dock. This was expected. A normal response to the weight of passengers climbing the portside gangplanks. Erickson responded by filling the starboard ballast tanks with water, counteracting the list. The ship righted itself, but the passengers kept coming, and most of them wanted to be on the upper decks. By 7:15 a.m., over 2,000 passengers were aboard. The ship was now significantly overcrowded on its upper decks, while the lower decks remained relatively empty. The distribution was dangerously uneven. Heavy concentrations of passengers lined the railings on the port side, the side facing the dock and the river, where they could wave to people still waiting to board. First Mate Del Fisher moved through the crowds, trying to encourage passengers to spread out and move to lower decks. But his efforts were largely ignored. It was a beautiful morning. Everyone wanted fresh air and a good view. At 7:20 a.m., Captain Pedersen gave the order to close the gangplanks. No more passengers would be allowed aboard. The official count showed 2,572 passengers and crew. This exceeded the ship's certified capacity of 2,500, but such overcrowding was common on excursion runs and generally tolerated by inspectors. Ericsson checked his ballast tanks. The ship was currently listing about 4 degrees to port. Not unusual or particularly dangerous, but worth monitoring. He pumped some water into the starboard ballast tanks to compensate. The ship straightened slightly, then it began listing again. More severely this time, 6 degrees, then 8. Passengers noticed. Some shifted their weight nervously. Others moved toward the starboard rail, instinctively trying to balance the vessel. The Cicero band, which had been playing cheerful music on the promenade deck, stopped mid-song. Ericsson, in the engine room below, watched his gauges with growing alarm. The list was accelerating. 10 degrees now. He opened valves to flood more water into the starboard ballast tanks, but the ship kept tilting. On deck, passengers began to panic. Chairs slid across the tilting surface. Children cried. Adults grabbed for railings. The list reached 15 degrees, then 20. Captain Pedersen, on the bridge, realized what was happening. He shouted orders to the crew. "Get everyone to starboard! Move the passengers to the high side!" But his voice was lost in the growing chaos. The ship was listing too fast for any organized response. 25 degrees. Water began pouring through the open gangway doors on the port side. The cold, polluted water of the Chicago River flooded onto the lower decks. Passengers on the port side found themselves sliding toward the water. Those on the starboard side clung desperately to railings as the deck beneath them became nearly vertical. 30 degrees. The ship was going over. There was no stopping it now. George Hilton stood on the dock, watching in horror. He was a Western Electric employee who had planned to board the Eastland that morning, but something had stopped him. An instinct, a feeling. He had worked on Great Lakes vessels for 20 years and knew ships. The Eastland had always made him uneasy. So, he had decided, at the last minute, not to board. Now he watched as the ship rolled onto its side. At 7:28 a.m. on July 24th, 1915, the SS Eastland completed its roll. The ship capsized completely, its port side now lying flat on the river bottom, its starboard side exposed to the morning air like the belly of a dead whale. The capsizing happened so quickly that many passengers didn't understand what was occurring until they were in the water. Those on the upper port side fell through the air, some landing on the exposed starboard hull, others plunging into the Chicago River. Those trapped inside the ship experienced a nightmarish moment as walls became floors and the world rotated 90 degrees. Then the water came. The Chicago River, brown and cold, poured through every opening. Gangway doors, portholes, ventilation shafts, windows. The ship filled with terrifying speed. Passengers trapped in the interior cabins and lower decks had seconds, perhaps less, to find air pockets or escape routes. Most found neither. Helen Reaper, 17 years old, had been in a cabin on the main deck when the ship rolled. The cabin door jammed shut as the ship tilted. Water poured in through the porthole. She found herself standing in what had been the cabin's wall, water rising rapidly around her. Above her head, an air pocket remained where the ceiling met the wall. She treaded water, her mouth pressed against the pocket, breathing the stale air. She could hear screaming from other parts of the ship. Then, gradually, the screaming stopped. She remained in that air pocket for nearly 3 hours before rescuers cut through the hull and pulled her out. She was one of the last survivors recovered from inside the ship. When rescuers asked her how she had survived, she couldn't answer. She had no explanation. She had simply refused to drown. On the dock, witnesses stood frozen in shock. Bradfield Ames, a Western Electric employee waiting to board, watched the ship roll. It was like watching a building fall over, he later testified. One moment it was there, upright, full of people. The next moment it was lying on its side, and people were in the water everywhere. He dove in immediately, pulling passengers from the river. The water was only 20 feet deep, but many passengers couldn't swim. Others were weighed down by heavy clothing or injured by the fall. Some were trapped under debris or caught in the ship's rigging. Fred Lisk, a deckhand on a nearby tugboat, also jumped into the water. He grabbed a young woman who was going under, pulled her to the surface, and pushed her toward rescuers on the dock. Then he grabbed another person, and another. He saved 7 people before exhaustion forced him out of the water. But the ship had rolled so quickly that most of those who ended up in the water had already drowned. The real tragedy was occurring inside the ship, where hundreds of passengers were trapped in the flooded interior with no way out. Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson survived. He had been in the engine room when the ship capsized, standing near an open hatch that led to the upper deck. As the ship rolled, he was thrown through the hatch and landed on what was now the starboard side of the ship. He was bruised and shaken, but alive. Captain Harry Pedersen also survived. He had been on the bridge when the ship rolled. He managed to climb out through a window as the ship went over. He stood on the exposed hull, looking at the chaos around him, knowing that hundreds of his passengers were dead or dying below his feet. Bobby Sindelar, the 8-year-old boy who had been so excited about his first steamship ride, found himself underwater when the ship rolled. He didn't remember how he got out. Years later, he recalled only darkness, cold, terror, and then suddenly being on the surface, gasping for air. A man grabbed him and pulled him toward the dock. He never knew who saved him. He never saw his mother again. The recovery of bodies from the SS Eastland continued throughout July 24th and into the night. By noon, firemen had cut numerous large openings in the exposed hull. They began entering the flooded compartments to retrieve the dead. Charles Creamer was a Chicago fireman assigned to body recovery. "We were in water up to our chests, pitch black, feeling our way forward," he said in a later interview. Bodies were everywhere, stacked on top of each other. The worst was the children, or finding a mother still holding her child, both dead. The bodies were passed through the hull openings to firemen outside, who carried them to the dock. The dock had been transformed into a temporary morgue. Hundreds of bodies lay in rows, covered with whatever blankets, tarps, and canvas sheets could be found. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed Chicago's morgue facilities. By late afternoon, the 2nd Regiment Armory on West Washington Street had been converted into an emergency morgue. Bodies were transported there by the dozens on wagons and trucks. They were laid out in rows on the armory floor. The city began the grim process of identification. Families descended on the armory by the thousands. The line of people waiting to enter stretched for blocks. Inside, family members walked slowly through the rows of bodies, looking for loved ones. The sounds of grief were continuous. Women collapsed upon finding their husbands or children. Men stood in stunned silence. Children cried for parents who would never answer. George Sindelar found his wife Minnie's body at the armory late Saturday evening. She was identified by the wedding ring on her finger and by the distinctive pattern of her dress. George stood over her body for nearly an hour, unable to speak, unable to move. His 8-year-old son, Bobby, was in Iroquois Memorial Hospital, being treated for injuries and exposure. His son had survived. His wife had not. By Sunday morning, July 25th, the death toll was becoming clear. 844 people had died in the disaster. 841 were passengers and 3 were crew members. The victims included 22 complete families, where every member had drowned. 186 were women, and 206 were children. The Western Electric Company's Hawthorne Works plant was devastated. Entire departments had lost most of their workers. Some families lost multiple members. The Novotny family lost 3 daughters. The Plachter family lost 7 members. The Sindelar family lost Minnie. The funerals began on Sunday and continued throughout the following week. Chicago's Czech, Polish, and Slovak neighbourhoods were engulfed in mourning. Some churches held multiple funeral services per day. Caskets filled every available hearse and wagon. In many cases, entire families were buried together. But while Chicago mourned, another process was beginning. The process of assigning blame and avoiding responsibility. The legal aftermath of the SS Eastland disaster began within hours of the capsizing. Federal authorities immediately launched investigations. The United States Department of Commerce's Steamboat Inspection Service, the agency responsible for certifying the ship's safety, faced obvious questions about how they had approved a vessel that capsized at the docks in calm water. Criminal charges were filed on July 27th, 3 hours after the disaster. A federal grand jury indicted the ship's captain, Harry Pedersen, the chief engineer, Joseph Erickson, and several executives of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, which operated the vessel. The charges included conspiracy to operate an unsafe vessel and criminal negligence resulting in death. The trial began in November 1915 in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis presiding. Landis was a former federal prosecutor known for his aggressive courtroom manner and his willingness to challenge powerful corporate interests. He would later become the first commissioner of baseball, famous for banning the Chicago Black Sox players after the 1919 World Series scandal. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward. The SS Eastland had a documented history of instability. Engineers had warned about its dangerous design. Federal inspectors had raised concerns. Yet the ship had continued operating. Someone had to be held responsible for 844 deaths. But the defense strategy was brilliantly simple. They blamed a dead man. Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson testified that the disaster was caused by improper ballast management by Second Engineer Joseph Egan, who had been operating the ballast controls immediately before the capsizing. Egan had died in the disaster. He couldn't defend himself. He couldn't explain his actions. He made a perfect scapegoat. The defense argued that Egan had improperly emptied the ballast tanks, removing the water weight that kept the ship stable. This had caused the list that led to capsizing. If Egan had properly managed the ballast, the disaster would never have occurred. It was a lie, but it was a convenient lie. Naval architects testified that the ship's fundamental design was flawed. The additional lifeboats required after the Titanic disaster had worsened an already marginal stability situation. But the defense countered that the ship had passed all required federal inspections. If federal inspectors had certified it as safe, how could the operators be held criminally responsible? The trial lasted months. Witnesses described the chaos of the disaster. Survivors recounted watching family members drown. But, in the end, the jury couldn't decide. Hung jury. The defendants walked free. A second trial in 1916 produced the same result. Hung jury. No convictions. A third trial was never held. The government gave up. No one was ever held criminally responsible for 844 deaths. The civil suits took years to resolve. After extensive litigation, a settlement was reached. The total payout? $20,000. That's approximately $23 per death. The cost of one dinner at a nice restaurant in 1915 Chicago. The most disturbing aspect of the SS Eastland disaster is how predictable it was. How many people knew the ship was dangerous and allowed it to operate anyway? Naval architect Sidney Jenks knew. He designed the ship with a narrow beam and high center of gravity that made it inherently unstable. He knew this when he finalized the design. He proceeded anyway because the owners prioritized passenger capacity and speed over stability. The ship's owners knew. They operated the vessel for 12 years despite multiple near-capsizes, repeated warnings from engineers, and documented stability problems. They knew the ship was dangerous. They operated it anyway because it was profitable. Federal Inspector Robert Reed knew. He certified the ship as safe just days before the disaster, despite never conducting proper stability tests. He knew he hadn't done his job thoroughly. He certified it anyway because thoroughness would have delayed the ship's operation and upset the owners. Captain Harry Pedersen knew. On the morning of July 24th, 1915, he knew his ship had a history of dangerous listing. He knew the additional lifeboats made it worse. He knew that overcrowding the upper decks would be dangerous. Yet he accepted over 2,500 passengers, allowed them to concentrate on the upper decks, and prepared to sail. Why? Because refusing would have meant cancelling the charter. It would have meant explaining to Western Electric Company and 7,000 disappointed people that his ship was unsafe. It would have meant admitting what everyone already knew, but nobody wanted to acknowledge. The SS Eastland should never have been carrying passengers. The disaster was entirely preventable. At dozens of decision points over 12 years, people with knowledge and authority could have acted to prevent it. Ship owners could have invested in major structural modifications or retired the vessel. Federal inspectors could have revoked its certification. Engineers could have refused to operate it. The Western Electric Company could have chartered different vessels. Nobody acted because acting would have been expensive, inconvenient, and complicated. The engineers who warned about the Eastland were vindicated by 844 deaths. But that vindication came too late to save anyone. The SS Eastland disaster should have become one of America's most remembered tragedies. 844 deaths. More than the Titanic. More than any other Great Lakes maritime disaster. A catastrophe that exposed fundamental failures in maritime regulation and corporate accountability. Instead, it was deliberately forgotten. World War I played a significant role. In July 1915, the war in Europe was escalating. The Lusitania had been sunk by a German U-boat just 2 months earlier, killing 1,198 people and pushing America closer to entering the war. News from Europe dominated headlines. The Eastland disaster, as horrific as it was, competed for attention, with accounts of trench warfare, poison gas attacks, and the dissolution of empires. But there was something else, something more deliberate. Chicago wanted to forget. The disaster was embarrassing. It reflected poorly on the city's governance, on federal oversight, on corporate responsibility. It raised uncomfortable questions about how a ship could pass federal inspection days before capsizing at the dock. How a vessel with a 12-year history of instability could continue operating. How 844 people could die and no one be held responsible. So Chicago moved on. The memorials were brief. The coverage diminished. Within months, the disaster had faded from national consciousness. Within years, it was rarely mentioned. The 2nd Regiment Armory, which had served as a temporary morgue, returned to normal use with no permanent marker, acknowledging what had happened there. The site of the disaster on the Chicago River showed no indication that 844 people had died there. For decades, the SS Eastland disaster existed only in the memories of survivors and the descendants of victims. George Sindelar never remarried after losing his wife Minnie. He raised his son Bobby alone, working at Western Electric for 40 more years, walking past the disaster site almost daily. He rarely spoke about the disaster. When he did, people often had never heard of it. Bobby Sindelar carried the trauma for his entire life. He had nightmares about drowning. He never learned to swim. He avoided boats. And he found himself unable to explain his fear to people who had never heard of the disaster that had killed his mother and nearly killed him. The forgotten disaster remained forgotten for generations. Maritime historians knew about it. Descendants of victims remembered. But most Americans, even most Chicagoans, had never heard the story. Then, gradually, the memory began to return. In the late 20th century, historians began researching and writing about the disaster. Descendants began organizing commemorations. In 1989, a small memorial plaque was installed near the disaster site. In 2003, a more substantial memorial was dedicated. On July 24, 2015, exactly 100 years after the disaster, several hundred people gathered for a centennial commemoration. The ceremony included reading all 844 names. It took over an hour. Among those attending was Brad Sindelar, great-grandson of George Sindelar. "My great-grandfather never really recovered," Brad told a reporter. "He raised my grandfather alone. He rarely spoke about Minnie or about the disaster. It was like a piece of his life had been cut out and the wound never healed. And it affected my grandfather and my father and me. Trauma echoes through generations. 844 people died in less than 5 minutes on July 24th, 1915. They died because multiple people and institutions knew their ship was dangerous and allowed it to operate anyway. They died because warning systems failed. They died because profit and convenience were prioritized over safety. And then their deaths were forgotten, erased from national memory through a combination of unfortunate timing and deliberate suppression. But the forgotten disaster is being remembered again. The names are being read aloud. The story is being told. The engineers who warned about the ship were proven right. Their vindication came in the form of 844 deaths.